And my name is Anna Ramich. I'm the Vice President and Chief of Staff here. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the Dirk Ippen lecture entitled Tracing the Black Sonic Avant-Garde, which marks the last Fellows lecture of this semester. That's the appropriate reaction, thank you. If you're on Vimeo, they've all booed. We are thrilled to have had Adam Shatz here with us this whole semester, as we are, the same is true for the rest of the class, obviously, who are all here this evening. And we will miss you all dearly, but it's not yet time, almost next week. Before I invite Pamela and then Adam up here, I would like to tell you a little bit about the fellowship that Adam is holding this semester, introduce him, and then introduce Pamela Z, one of our fellows. As I mentioned, Adam Shatz is here this semester as the Dirk Ippen Fellow, and that fellowship was inaugurated in 2012 and named after Dirk Ippen, the publisher of the Münchener Zeitungsverlag and also a trustee of the American Academy. He couldn't be here this evening, but we are incredibly grateful to him for his continued support of our work through this fellowship and through his work on our board. We're also very happy to have another trustee here with us this evening, Christine Wallich here or Wallach, depending on how you want to pronounce it, depending on which country you're in, I think you said last night. Okay. And we'll see Dirk next week with us here at the board meeting. Over the years, the Dirk Ippen Fellowship has brought to the Academy some of the most vital voices in journalism, literature, and the arts. Past fellows include acclaimed poet and scholar Claudia Rankine, translator and literary visionary Samantha Schnee, founder of Words Without Borders, and many others. And we're delighted to count Adam Shatz amongst them now. Adam is a writer, editor, cultural critic whose work illuminates the complex intersections of politics, history, and the arts. His writing has appeared in the London Review of Books, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, among others, and his recently published book, The Rebels Clinic, The Revolutionary Lives of Frantz Fanon, has been hailed as a profound and necessary re-examination of one of the 20th century's most important thinkers. That book is for sale right outside of this room. Afterward, at the end of the event, you can buy it. Maybe Adam will sign it for you if he feels up to it. Next to his role at the London Review of Books, Adam is a visiting professor at Bard College. He's also the author of Prophet's Outcast, a century of dissident Jewish writing about Zionism in Israel, and Writers and Missionaries, essays on the radical imagination. He is the host of Myself with Others, a podcast about the life of ideas, featuring conversations with creative minds in the arts, culture, and writing. And just recently, the book I mentioned about Frantz Fanon has been shortlisted for 2 prizes, the Plutarch Prize in Biography and the Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography. So congratulations on that, Adam. It's very well deserved. And most importantly for us here tonight, Adam has been obsessed with music and jazz since he was 12, the time that he was also a child chef. You can go ahead and read that story online as well. And he wrote essays about canonical and lesser-known jazz artists, jazz musicians over the years, which you can also read all online. Before Adam comes up here on the lectern, I would like to invite our current Deutsche Bank Fellow in Music Composition, Pamela Z, to give, Pamela Z, depending on what country you're in, to give brief remarks on this topic and on Adam's work more generally. Pamela Z is a composer, performer, and media artist working primarily with voice, live electronics, sampled sound, and video. While a student at the University of Colorado, she studied classical bel canto vocal technique and music education and relocated to San Francisco soon after college. Pamela's adopted home proved to be a nurturing space for her category-defying musical work, which centers on voice and live electronics with performance and multimedia art. Pamela's work has received support from the American Academy in Rome, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and she is a recipient of the Doris Duke Artist Impact Award, the Herb Alpert Award, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, amongst others. With that, Pamela, I would like to give the podium to you. Actually, no, one second. A few housekeeping remarks. After Pamela's remarks, Adam will come up here and speak for about 35 minutes. Following that, there will be an audience Q&A. And at that point, if you're here with us in the room, just raise your hand and you will be called upon. And do make sure that your question is indeed a question. And if you're joining us via Vimeo, please type your question into the Q&A. And now, without further ado, Pamela, the floor is yours.
So it has been my great pleasure to be a Berlin Prize cohort with the likes of Adam Shatz. Adam is well known for his political and literary writing, but he is also has tremendous respect and long-held friendships in the communities of experimental contemporary jazz and avant-garde music. I find his music writing to be passionate, insightful, sensitive, and deeply informed. For example, I enjoyed a thorough, affectionately written essay about Meredith Monk, in which he managed to beautifully and accurately capture details of her history, her aesthetic approach, and her place within the contemporary music and performance world. For me, perhaps the most treasured takeaways from my time here in Berlin are the friendships that blossomed over these past months. And among those, my conversations with Adam about the concerts we attended and the music we both find engaging are really the standouts. So that said, I really want to keep these remarks brief so that most of the time this evening can be devoted to Adam's talk, which I'm sure will be brilliant. So without further ado, I'm honored to give you Adam Shatz.
Thanks so much, Pamela, for your words. I'm very touched by them. Spending time with Pamela, an artist for whom I have enormous admiration, has been among the highlights of my time at the Academy. I'm also extremely grateful to Daniel Benjamin, Anna Ramich, Johanna Gallup, Julian Kramer, Kristen Allen, Linda Rossi, the extraordinary kitchen and waiting staff, and all those who make the Academy such a haven for writing and thinking. I also want to thank my fellow fellows, or if it's not too presumptuous, the friends I've made here. Their breadth of interest, creativity, and kindness have been humbling. It's not quite a band, but it is a group, and I hope we'll continue to make good music together. When I returned home to New York in 2011 after a few years in London, one of the things I looked forward to was going to hear jazz more regularly. But when I walked into one of my favorite clubs, the now defunct Jazz Standard, the man at the door told me that while my name sounded like it was on the list, it was in fact another Adam Shatz. This other man, who spelled his name with a silent C, was a young musician and concert promoter. Adam Schtz, it turned out, had appeared on the scene during my absence. I ended up writing a piece about it for the LRB blog. The title? Adam Shatz and I aren't confused so much anymore. Over the last 14 years in New York, I seem to have reestablished my identity in the jazz world. Still, I find myself occasionally prey to a different kind of confusion. You write on music? I had no idea. Although I've written on music for nearly 3 decades, I often hear this from people who know me more from my writing about the Middle East or Fanon or some other subject. Sometimes the question has an air of befuddlement, as if writing about jazz were a frivolous diversion from what really matters, as if art itself were a form of escapism, rather than a different and potentially subversive entry point into the world of politics and society. I've never seen the kinds of writing that I do as mutually exclusive or even as all that different. I became interested in jazz as an adolescent, at the same time that I became interested in the civil rights movement and other struggles against racial and colonial domination. Whether I'm writing about Fanon's rebellion against French rule in Algeria or Ornette Coleman's rebellion against chord changes, I find myself mulling over similar questions. Questions about structure and change, the individual and the collective, oppression and freedom, racism and identity, about the struggles of outsiders to make their existence felt and their ideas known, questions about community, belonging, and what it means to be modern. I was introduced at age 12 to the music of John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, and Miles Davis by my father, who'd heard them all live and had a great vinyl collection. Of course, I'll never cease to be envious of his having seen them live. Coltrane's mesmerizing soprano saxophone solo on My Favorite Things, Monk's mile-wide cadences on April in Paris, Miles's ability to convey romantic desolation with a few well-placed notes spoke to me immediately. Hearing that music was, I suspect, the closest I'll ever come to an ecstatic religious experience. But it wasn't until my early 20s that I considered writing about jazz. It happened almost by accident. An editor at the Village Voice literary supplement who'd heard of my interest in jazz asked if I would review a book by Nat Hentoff, a former voice writer whose opposition to abortion rights had so infuriated the staff that a freelancer had to be assigned the piece. Hentoff had produced historic sessions by Charles Mingus and Cecil Taylor in the late 50s and early 60s and written liner notes to albums by Coltrane and other heroes of mine. An ardent supporter of the civil rights struggle, he'd risen to the defense of the singer Abby Lincoln when the critic Ira Gitler attacked her in the pages of Downbeat. Although I'd read more of Amiri Baraka than the young Hentoff, I had more in common by affiliation with the latter, a lefty Jewish journalist who insisted on the political dimensions of the music. But as I was to discover, writing about music is not the same as writing about politics and history. The classical composer Virgil Thompson, himself a fine critic, wondered if it was even possible. Writing about music, he said, is like dancing about architecture. Write exclusively about note choices, pitches, and the like, and you end up with formal analyses that will be of little interest to anyone except to practitioners. Write about the social and political dimensions of musical creation, and you risk overlooking its sensuous and aesthetic properties. The microscopic view results in a sterile formalism, the macroscopic view in a reduction of music to a mere reflection, a response to larger forces. Perhaps the most effective intellectual response to a piece of music is another piece of music, not a piece of writing. The object of music criticism, the experience of the music itself, remains perpetually elusive. Yet the best writing on music, in my experience at least, can enrich your understanding of it, and therefore your experience, by illuminating the struggles that brought it about, its meaning to those who composed or played it, bringing you closer to what the saxophonist Oliver Lake has called the point at which creation begins. So if you want to get inside the music, you have to write around it as well as write about it. With avant-garde jazz, there's a lot to write around. That's partly because jazz is an African-American art form, a gift to a country that has mostly taken it for granted, but it's also because jazz is a music of indirection, of unexpected bypaths, of gnomic commentaries and hidden codes, of ironical deflection and sly suggestion. It's not as inaccessible, scary, weird, or cultish as some people think, but anyone who writes about it has more than a little explaining to do. What does it mean? It depends on who you ask. Some have seen jazz as an expression of American democracy. Sigh. Others have portrayed it as a cry of revolt. The German Jewish aesthetic philosopher Theodor Adorno, in a notorious essay entitled Perennial Fashion, Jazz, published in 1964. Here's Adorno. claimed that the music's aim was the mechanical reproduction of a regressive moment, a castration symbolism, leading to the acceptance of a dreamless, realistic world in which all memories of things not wholly integrated have been purged. With all due respect to Teddy Adorno, I am more persuaded by the words of jazz's greatest composer, the man the New Yorker called in 1944 the Hot Bach. I'm speaking of Edward Kennedy Ellington, better known as Duke Ellington.
Where did you get your ideas from?
Your ideas? Oh, man, I got a million dreams. That's all I do is dream all the time.
I thought you played piano.
No, this is not piano. This is dreaming.
I really wish I could answer questions like that. But seriously, while I've been here at the Academy, I've come to think that this is a book about dreaming in sound. There are, of course, many ways of dreaming, many kinds of sounds, not all of them as svelte and seductive as the Ellington Reverie you just heard. In the case of jazz, a music whose major innovators have largely been African American, it couldn't have been otherwise. As Ellington himself said, dissonance is our way of life in America. We are something apart, yet an integral part. Much of the music I discuss was first experienced by many of its listeners as strange, unsettling, even frightening. The so-called moldy figs who worship New Orleans swing poured scorn on bebop, whose leaders, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk, were the first generation of jazz musicians to project themselves explicitly as artists. Philip Larkin accused John Coltrane of trying to be ugly on purpose. A book could be written about the vicious, willfully uncomprehending commentary on jazz. It takes courage and resilience to express what hasn't been expressed before, to break through that wall of resistance. As Abby Lincoln discovered when she recorded Prayer, Protest, Peace with Max Roach on We Insist, Freedom Now Sweet, your dreams might be someone else's nightmare. It's worth noting that Lincoln had never screamed in her life when she recorded this track. Max Roach asked her to imagine stumbling on a man hanging from a tree with his testicles chopped off before they recorded this. With her screams, she was using extended vocal techniques, carrying the music further away from traditional singing, further into the realm of abstraction. But her screams were also programmatic, evoking an experience of oppression and horror that some listeners considered external to aesthetics. She would pay a heavy price for her defiance. A year after the release of We Insist, she was accused of being a professional Negro, a fellow traveler of Elijah Muhammad when she released the brilliant album under her own name, Straight Ahead. More than a decade would pass before she recorded under her own name again. Today, Prayer, Protest, Peace is widely regarded not merely as a path-breaking work of protest jazz, but as a formally radical gesture. In fact, it was both. In the history of the jazz avant-garde, formal experimentation and political critique have often gone hand in hand. The avant-garde struggle has always been twofold: to achieve freedom from oppression, but also from the restrictive, racially coded aesthetic conventions about what Black music is or can be. It has sought to clear a space for what Monk called ugly beauty, forms of expression that initially seemed bizarre, even alienating, whether the bent notes of Monk, the tone clusters of Cecil Taylor, the multiphonics of John Coltrane, or the vocalizations of Lincoln and Jeanne Lee. Whether or not Black music is always radical in the context of formal American culture, as Amiri Baraka claimed in his 1963 book, Blues People, it is, like all music, a worldly affair, situated in, created in, and reflecting the world with which it is enmeshed, sometimes directly, sometimes obliquely. My book is an exploration of how musicians thought, not just about music, but about the world, their place in it, their roles and responsibilities as artists. In the 1960s and 70s, musicians often described their work in revolutionary, even utopian terms. In a self-published pamphlet on improvisation, the trumpeter Wadada Leo Smith, one of the book's subjects, claimed that creative Black music, the term he preferred to jazz, forecast the end of European music, even the end of the political dominance of Euro-America in this world. This prediction was echoed by musicians and critics, who often alluded to figures like Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, and Patrice Lumumba. Today, the claims about the music's inherent revolutionary militancy seem somewhat quaint for a genre that hasn't been close to the barricades in decades and isn't likely to return. Still, in the words of Duke Ellington, music is a language. It expresses more than just sound. Those who write about jazz have to attend not only to its sounds, but to its language, its lower frequencies, the attitude and philosophy that its exponents express, their lives and struggles. I'm trying to click something. It's not.
Go to the right. Like that?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. Sorry. I can read. I'm completely incompetent with modern technology. In the 19th, as Ornette Coleman once said, everything is music. I've lifted Coleman's remark as my book's title. It's divided into 6 sections, organized more thematically than chronologically. The first explores the age of revolutions, reflecting on the lives of Coleman, John Coltrane, Cecil Taylor, and Nina Simone, who embodied the radical styles of will of Black music in the 60s, political, aesthetic, spiritual, sometimes all 3 at once. In the second section, Fallen Stars, I write about the tragically abbreviated lives of Charlie Parker, the trumpeter Lee Morgan, who was murdered by his common-law wife, Helen Moore, the gay minimalist Julius Eastman, forgotten in his own time, now an almost saintly figure, and Jimi Hendrix. In the third section, Blues and Roots, I examine a group of composers and performers, including Charles Mingus, Miles Davis, and Julius Hemphill, who radically extended and transformed the language of the blues. In the following section, A Nomadic Act, I write about artists such as Don Cherry, Mal Waldron, and Alice Coltrane, whose work was enlarged and enhanced by the experience of exile from the United States. Or by the embrace of non-Western forms of music, or both. The fifth section, Worlds They Have Not Told You Of, an allusion to Sun Ra, focuses on the 70s avant-garde, particularly the composers of the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, an extraordinarily influential Chicago-based collective of Black musicians created in 1965. This is followed by a series of portraits of contemporary musicians, notably the pianist Craig Taborn and the drummer Tyshawn Sorey, Anxieties of Influence, Jazz in the 21st Century. In a coda, I remember the late Stanley Crouch, Julius Hemphill, Don Cherry, Mel Waldron. That's Stanley. In a coda, I remember the late Stanley Crouch, whose career I draw on to examine the relationship between the music and its critics. And in an epilogue, I write about why live performance will always remain critical to our understanding of a music whose meaning lies not only in the notes, but, as Don Cherry insisted, in the space between the notes. Through these individual portraits, I hope to show how jazz changed as it grew into an art music in the aftermath of bebop, the expansion of ambition and form, the adoption of a wider palette of emotion, mood, and expression, the growing fascination with musical traditions outside the West, as well as in Europe, the exploration of modes, atonality, and unconventional timbres. The result is a proliferation of styles, none of which would be mistaken for the other, urbane and countrified, minimalist and maximalist, lyrical and dissonant, soulful and hermetic. The raucous polyphonic music of Charles Mingus, the stark lyricism of the trumpeter Wadada Leo Smith, the angular, funky compositions of Julius Hemphill with their echoes of Texan blues and West African rituals, the poetic, mystical sound art of Jeanne Lee, the Dadaist rituals of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, the disco-inflected, homoerotic minimalism of Julius Eastman, the Bach-infused blues cabaret of Nina Simone, who never ceased to regret being denied entry into the world of classical music, the solemn devotional music of John and Alice Coltrane, the enigmatic cool of Miles Davis, who fashioned himself as the Prince of Darkness, the surreal orchestrations of Henry Threadgill, shaped by the trauma he suffered in Vietnam, the hushed, austere music of Taishan Sori, the neo-spiritual jazz of Kamasi Washington. Throughout the book, I try to resist the temptations of iconography, depicting the artists of the Black musical avant-garde as the visionary and flawed individuals they were and are. But I'd be lying if I claimed to be untouched by the aura, the grandeur that emanates from this tradition of struggle and invention. Names like Coltrane, Miles, and Ornette refer to people, but they also refer to the fields of expression they opened, continents of sound that have yet to be fully explored, like Borges's Garden of Forking Paths, or perhaps more to the point, Sun Ra's Other Planes of There. To listen to the music of the Black avant-garde is to tap into the exhilarating freedom that it has always embodied, a force of liberation, aesthetic and form, but rich in political implications, that is as urgently needed today as it has ever been. After Charlie Parker died in 1955, the poet Ted Jones scrawled a new slogan over the walls of downtown New York: "Bird lives." He still does, and so do the artists in this book. That many of them, like Parker, are now specters does not make them any less alive to me, and I doubt I'm alone. It's often said that jazz as we know it is dead, but as the trumpeter Lester Bowie famously said, that depends on what you know, or whether you even use the word. Duke Ellington insisted that he wrote Negro folk music, not jazz. Mingus considered jazz, quote, a little stupid language hanging out there as a sign of unfair employment, and preferred ethnic folk dance music. This is my personal favorite. Max Roach declared in the early 70s that he was at work on a book whose title was I Hate Jazz. Personally, I have no problem with jazz, the word, which has largely shed its associations with the brothels in which it was first performed. But the term I use more often is the music, the one preferred by musicians, since it reflects a rejection of genre classifications that have so often served as markers of race and class. The music also honors the existence of a Black continuum or changing same, to quote Amiri Baraka, whose writing has deeply influenced my own. As Baraka pointed out in his 1966 essay on R&B and the new Black music, jazz isn't the only innovative form of Black music. James Brown's screams, he noted, were as radical as the sounds of Ornette Coleman's horn. Charles Mingus, Jeanne Lee, Marion Brown, Miles, obviously. Probably the most photogenic person of the 20th century. and if I can get to him. The arrows? Oh, Amiri Baraka. I became aware of the Black continuum early on because at the very moment I was learning about jazz, I was also discovering soul and R&B, to Prince, Sly Stone, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye. I knew these forms of music were related. I just didn't know how exactly. I also sensed obscurely that the more experimental forms of jazz had affinities with European modernism and with American minimalism, from Lamont Young to Steve Reich. In the early 90s, I was a DJ on the afternoon new music show at KCR, Columbia's radio station. Once a week from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., I would play works of 20th century new music alongside works by jazz modernists like Cecil Taylor and Anthony Braxton, as if to prove that the latter deserved as much consideration as the former. I remember a particularly breathless speech about Cecil Taylor that I hope no one has recorded or even remembers. I don't regret this. It was a way of educating myself and registering my sense of injustice. Isn't that what college is for? Well, it used to be. But over time, I realized that my error was to overemphasize the debt of Afro-American modernists to Euro-American modernism, and to underestimate the influence of jazz on American composers, particularly the minimalists. It is, of course, true that among American jazz musicians, there was a great admiration for Euro-American modernism. Alice and John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and others adored Stravinsky's work. Charlie Parker sought out Edgar Varese, and Eric Dolphy played Varese. And Anthony Braxton still worships Schoenberg and Stockhausen. But while jazz artists have sometimes borrowed from the European avant-garde, or vice versa, the overlaps between these movements have more often been serendipitous convergences than cases of direct influence. As James Sneed argued, the tendency to stretch the limits of the instrument may have been there already, since the wail of the first blues guitar, the whisper of the first muted trumpet, or the growl of the first jazz trombonist. The repetition in John Coltrane's Africa Brass, which had such a decisive impact on the young Steve Reich, is different from the repetition in Reich's music. Nonetheless, the relations between these forms of music, artificially kept apart by musical segregation, are more porous than usually understood. And throughout my book, I explore this overlooked dialogue between African-American and Euro-American avant-gardes. Lester Bowie, whom I mentioned earlier, a founding member of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, described jazz as the first music that was representative of the whole planet because of its open, elastic nature, its supple receptiveness to foreign influence. While my focus is on the 60s avant-garde and its aftermath, sonic experimentation of this sort has deep roots in jazz and arguably goes back even further in the history of Black American music. It was a new song W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in his 1935 history, Black Reconstruction in America. And its deep and plaintive beauty, its great cadences and wild appeal, wailed, throbbed, and thundered on the world's ears with a message seldom voiced by man. They sneered at it, those white Southerners who heard and never understood. They raped and defiled it, those white Northerners who listened without ears. Yet it lived and grew, and it sits today at the right hand of God as America's one real gift to beauty, as slavery's one redemption distilled from the dross of its dung. The composer George Lewis told me that when he was playing trombone in the Count Basie band, he would sometimes pretend to play notes but make no noises at all. He told me it was his way of paying homage to John Cage's silent piece 433. Another musician in the band confronted him in anger, then complained to Basie about New Boy, which was George's nickname. Basie's reply was, "Is New Boy playing his parts?" "Well, yes," the musician admitted. "Then I don't see a problem." Basie replied, This music is all about experimenting." George was afraid he'd be disciplined, but Basie took him aside and said, "Keep doing what you're doing." As the saxophonist and composer Julius Hemphill put it, tradition in African American music is innovation, and it is as wide open as all outdoors. Yet while the music changes, it somehow retains its identity, replenishing itself periodically at the source of its creativity, turning the shock of the old into the shock of the new. I think of Ornette Coleman arriving in New York in 1959, startling Leonard Bernstein at the 5 spot with a sound that came from the Texan backwoods. Or Miles, just as he's about to go electric, plunging into James Brown and Sly Stone, even as he's studying Bach and Stockhausen. I think of Marion Brown, immersing himself in the writing of Jean Toomer and in the music of Satie and Debussy during a residency at the Cité des Arts in Paris that will inspire a remarkable trilogy of albums, works of pastoral blues impressionism on his return to the United States. The radicalism of this music lies not only in its daring sense of adventure, its lighting out for new territories, but in its pride and sense of identity, its understanding of the strength and power of this tradition. Like the work of such composers as Bartok, Stravinsky, and Janacek, this music is a vernacular modernism at once homegrown, as the pianist Jerry Allen titled one of her early albums, and outward bound, to quote Eric Dolphy. The musicians I'm writing about weren't a monolith, any more than their contemporaries in the classical avant-garde, but they took part in a common struggle against oppression and against more subtle constraints and discriminations imposed by genre, taste, and conventional aesthetic standards. That's why I prefer to speak less of jazz than of a certain tendency towards sonic and formal experimentation that runs through the history of this music. Whether or not they embraced an explicit politics, the artists I write about were engaged in a practice of freedom, a practice rooted in a refusal to be pinned down, to accept limited notions of what they could do as artists or as citizens. One that envisions a society based on equality and creative expression, not the right of some citizens to dominate others, the darker strain of American freedom that my colleague here, Jefferson Cowie, has evoked so powerfully in his book, Freedom's Dominion. The music they've made can't be reduced to politics, but neither can it be separated from it. My thinking about what jazz musicians do has been profoundly influenced by my readings of Baraka and Ralph Ellison, who had more in common than either of them understood. A.B. Spellman, who wrote the best book on the 60s avant-garde, 4 Lives in the Bebop Business, and the British writer and photographer Val Wilmer, who wrote the best book on the 70s avant-garde, As Seriously as Your Life. But I'd like to close with a tribute to a musician whose work, thinking, and imagination have shaped this book as much as any writer. Here is Cecil Taylor in the documentary Imagine the Sound.
It seems to me what music is everything that you do. And once again, the idea about this not being a seminar is that hopefully everything that that I try to do in this situation has the same kind of control over the senses that the making of the particular art of music is. So to read or dance, to converse is all a part of the making of music. So that when one walks down the street and one looks, and if there is a fuchsia colored awning sticking out on the 30th floor, one says, oh, wow. So that, to me, what it is everything one does. When you're out there making art and accepting the final responsibility of knowing that your livelihood depends upon it, then you go forward into it, but you want to also come to understand that nobody really asked you to do this. Because, all the things that we've said about the non-recognition or, Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, what it simply means is that, like,
In 1988, a year before the wall fell, Cecil Taylor spent nearly 2 months in Berlin on a residency, performing with some of Europe's finest musicians, serving as a one-man bridge between two schools that had drifted apart, the Black American avant-garde and European free improvisation. Taylor had never sounded more joyous than in the music he made in Berlin. It had been 2 years since the death of Jimmy Lyons, the alto saxophonist who was his closest collaborator. And after a period of silence, he was ready to play again. Berlin treated him well. He was given his own driver, a young man who would later become his lover, went for long walks in the Tiergarten, the vast park at the center of the city, and spent his nights dancing in discotheques where strangers kept him supplied with his favorite chemicals. It was like the Godfather had arrived, the bassist William Parker told me, describing the welcome Cecil received in Berlin. Cecil was around a positive thing in Europe, and there wasn't anything to drag him down. Over those 2 months, Parker shared an apartment with Taylor and often cooked for him. It was the closest Taylor ever came to a domestic life. He loved being taken care of, but as Parker recalls, he was fighting with being normal, like, is everything okay? When I asked Parker what those concerts in Berlin were like, he remembered something the bassist Cyrone Norris Jones told him. The great thing about playing with Cecil, Cyrone told him, is that when you play with him, you know you're going to go all the way, and you're not going to stop until the music gets where it's going. One night, Taylor went all the way with Parker and the drummer Tony Oxley, the other members of his field trio, and Taylor was exultant. Oxley, who was in charge of collecting the money, asked how he would divide it. Just keep the money, Taylor said. The music was so good, I don't want the money. I'm very happy because we were able to play music tonight and nothing else counts. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you for an amazing talk and exhilarating. Who should I listen to now? Is anybody making anything?
There are a lot of great musicians on the scene. Just to rattle off a few names. The cellist Tamika Reed, the pianist Alexander Hawkins. There are a lot of musicians in their 70s and 80s who are producing incredible work, like Roscoe Mitchell, Wadada Leo Smith, Joe Lovano. Craig Taborn is a pianist who I think is one of the great performing artists in any genre. There's really no shortage of exciting music out there. And at the same time, I think that to an increasing extent, improvised music and what one used to call avant-garde jazz, although it's not really an avant-garde anymore, have kind of become something else by merging with other forms of music. And so these categories become less and less important. So I'm always a little hesitant to make quote unquote jazz recommendations. Of course, there are also people working in more of a kind of jazz repertoire format who are producing great work. For example, there's a wonderful pianist named Sullivan Fortner, who was an accompanist of Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, and he's been putting out really gorgeous and inventive records, very much in a traditional mode. So you can find that as well.
I got to ask a follow-up. Hendrix is in the book.
Well, I'm including a number of figures who really are not jazz musicians. That's why I'm writing about someone like Nina Simone, for example. Nina Simone did not consider herself a jazz, and she was not a jazz musician. She sometimes just called herself a classical musician, and I see her, as more of a musician working at a convergence of cabaret, blues, classical music, folk. Hendrix nearly collaborate on an album with Jimi Hendrix, but and at the same time that he was sleeping with Miles's wife. And unfortunately, he died before they were able to make a record. But I mean, Hendrix had an enormous impact on Miles, and John McLaughlin in those late 1960s and early 70s recordings was obviously quite influenced by him. But what attracts me to Hendrix is that he is, he's someone who is very nimble and inventive with sound. I mean, he's a self-taught musician who is just a visionary of strange and unusual sounds, and he makes things that are wrong sound completely right. And so I do think that he has a place there.
You mentioned Baraka. Sorry. I'm not sure I didn't need it, but you mentioned Baraka and Ellis in the talk, and I was wondering if we could say more about what you're thinking in the book in terms of a discussion of this music's influence on the other arts, because it really strikes me. I like Mal Wilder, and I know who that is.
And Frank O'Hara.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's almost on the scale. I mean, this is another analogy to European music, I suppose, but like the impact that opera had on painting, on, so yeah, like, it's hard to think of another art that's had such a huge impact on all the other arts. And I'm wondering how, as a writer, someone who obviously knows this, how one deals with that. Is it like part of the story?
Yeah, no, it's an enormous subject, and of course, the jazz avant-garde of the late 50s, early 1960s in New York City emerges against the backdrop of a very dynamic and exciting poetry scene. Frank O'Hara being one of the figures, but also Allen Ginsberg and A.B. Spellman and Amiri Baraka. Amiri Baraka was hosting parties with his wife at the time, Hetty Jones, at their place at 29 Cooper Square, where the saxophonist Archie Shepp lived with his family, and also Marzette Watts. So, I mean, these worlds, were overlapping. Visual art too. I mean, the painter Bob Thompson is someone who's friends with Ornette Coleman and Marion Brown, and he paints this gorgeous painting called The Garden of Music, which features depictions of Sonny Rollins, Ornette, Don Cherry, and others. I do talk about, to some extent, about the impact of jazz on poets, particularly in a section of the book about John Coltrane, because John Coltrane becomes a subject for poets in the black arts movement in the late 1960s, particularly after his death in 1967. It was almost a fashion to write a John Coltrane poem. I mean, everyone did. Michael Harper, Amiri Baraka, Spellman, Nikki Giovanni. So, the music influences the way the poetry is written, and some of the poets were directly involved in the making of jazz. For example, in 1964, the New York Art Quartet released a record that included a reading by Mary Baraka of Black Dot and Nihilismus, a particularly incendiary poem. It's an incredible performance. You can find it online. So yes, I'm trying to address that to some extent, but it really is a subject in its own right.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question? I mean, it's actually not directly connected, but so Pierre Bourdieu, the sociologist of art, he had a really great, clear explanation for why it is that individual writers or artists in whatever field are the particular works that they work. And without being cynical, he actually argued that this had less to do with individual genius or whatever, and more with every artist's sort of unconscious awareness of their position on a kind of sociological field, which Bourdieu kind of maps out famously in terms of a grid of like various kinds of like cultural status and stuff. But to boil it down, the argument is that Toni Morrison, to use a literary example, right, is Toni Morrison the best example for why Toni Morrison is Toni Morrison has, you could say, well, her work is a reflection of a kind of inheritance from Faulkner. You could talk about her writing as a kind of reflection of some social forces. But the kind of more local reason why Toni Morrison is Toni Morrison is because she didn't want to be Alice Walker.
Mhm.
So she sees this other really famous writer who's like, okay, this writer does these stories that that are about have empathetic heroines. So I'm going to write these stories with these heroines that you can't identify with,
Mhm.
that are cold, that are that are this is very Morrison, that are inscrutable, like Sula. And so this model of how why the arts look the way they do is very, of course, influential, and it actually is really good at explaining like avant-garde movements. So, for example, in to take the poetry scene, for example, there's the Black Arts movement in the '60s. There's a New York school. There is Ginsberg.
San Francisco. There's
Yeah, but then there's language poetry in the '70s, and all of these various movements are become what they are in response to their relationship to the other. So I'm just really curious.
No, it's a
In
great
your scene,
it's a great question.
was there a divide?
No. Well, there are many divisions which I explore to some extent. I mean, even to this day, there are divisions between the New York scene, which in the '70s was organized around lofts. Probably the most famous of which was Studio Rivby, owned by the saxophonist Sam Rivers and his wife Beatrice, and the musicians of the AACM, the Chicago Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. Many of those Chicago musicians, in fact, most of the leaders of that movement, eventually settled in New York City, but their approach to music was very, very different from most of the New York artists. You could say that they were working with appropriation, with collage. Their music grew out of intensive research and introspection. I'm speaking in very broad terms, of course. And New York had been a scene for energy music. New York was also not a particularly congenial place for artists. It was a very difficult place to survive, and a lot of musicians ended up leaving. So the musicians in Chicago had benefited from this ethic of solidarity, of self-improvement, of teaching, pooling resources, and so on. So in many ways, they were, I think, more poised to really prosper in New York City, and many of them had very long careers, while quite a few New York musicians left or died rather young. So, this book is about geography and about movements, and not just about individuals. I like to write I like to do portraiture because I do feel that often, I'm dealing with figures whose music hasn't really received the attention it deserves, and I'd like to talk about it with care and texture, and not to flatten them, and to really talk about its individual properties. And I think, and to go back to a point that you were just making, many of these musicians are working out their aesthetics, their style of music, their sound, and sound is the word that's most often used, against other musicians. I mean, taking a figure like Marion Brown, whom I mentioned earlier. Marion Brown is an alto saxophonist who emerges around the same time as, just a few years after, Ornette Coleman, and he's a very literary-minded guy and had once thought about being a playwright or a poet. And he arrives at a sound that is very soft, very lyrical, almost fragile. It's very different from Ornette Coleman's sound, and certainly very different from John Coltrane's sound, although interestingly, his real debut, in a sense, is on Ornette Coleman's great free-blowing record, Ascension. So I am interested in these geographical and movement conflicts, but I really want to highlight the contributions of these musicians. But I mean, in a sense, I think I'm with Bourdieu on this. These musicians are emerge out of networks and scenes and specific histories, and to really properly understand what they're doing, you have to understand those movements, and you have to understand the musical traditions that they emerge out of. Jazz is a music that's only a little more than a century old, and yet it is one of the most historically minded of musicians. And musicians are always thinking about who came before them. I mean, you can't understand a musician like John Coltrane without knowing Coleman Hawkins. You know, I mean, you just this is, you know, essential to an understanding of that work. It's just as essential as knowing, you know, who came before Beethoven. You know, you need to know those Bach fugues that Beethoven is citing in a piano sonata, and I think jazz makes similar requirements of those who write about it.
I had my hand up first. I loved your takedown of Adorno in particular. I have a question that's somewhat related, and that also relates to what Jeanne just highlighted.
Jeanne thinks I was being very, very cheap and bringing up Adorno here in that mode, but
Maybe
and
she
it probably
does.
was. I actually really love Adorno, but
No, but I
know,
think in this context,
nobody's perfect,
I
as
think
Billy
in
Wilder
this,
said.
no, I think in this context it really works because, and this is my question, I'm wondering to what extent your thick description also includes the transatlantic relationship. So you highlighted very nicely how the tradition goes back to Stockhausen, it goes back to the Avant-Garde, but then, of course, we have the New York poets, and we have a very rich reception of the New York poets and of the Beat generation and of others who were important in the post 1945 scene in Germany. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the musical reception and, you know, like apart from Adorno or maybe against Adorno even to some extent. And I think that just to elaborate more on that, I do think that what you talked about in terms of the sound and the actual art was against theory. So I'm wondering if that shapes your thinking.
Well, I think, you know, I'll offer an anecdote that I think is I think is a response to that question. It's a very good one about the transatlantic relationship as it pertains to this country, to Germany. A young man was growing up. He was really a boy in Germany after the war. He was, I think he was about 10 years old in 1910, a little over maybe 10, 12 years old in 1945. And he became a music student and studied with Adorno. And it was his intention to write a thesis about the avant-garde, and I think he was also planning to write about jazz and its relationship to the avant-garde because in the late 1950s and 60s, European listeners were becoming aware of this new phenomenon, which had been announced by Ornette's performance at the Five Spot in 1959. And this young man's name was Karl Berger. And Berger was a vibraphonist, and he felt a bit torn because on the one hand, he was very admiring of Adorno, who was a genius, an incredibly brilliant mind. And on the other hand, he was going to clubs, and he loved jazz. He'd first heard it performed by American soldiers when he was a child, and he got a research grant to go to Paris. And while he was in Paris, he met a trumpeter who was pretty much a nomad living in various parts of Europe, Don Cherry, who had been the trumpeter in Ornette Coleman's band. And when he heard Don Cherry, he decided that was it for the thesis. He was just going to join. And Don Cherry invited him to a practice session. And the musicians were all from other parts of the world. There was a musician from Italy, a musician from Argentina. I think it was the Argentine saxophonist Gatto Barbieri, an Italian musician, and Don Cherry just said, "Meet us here at 5:00," and disappeared. And at 5:00, they met, and that was it. And later, Karl Berger, who had a very successful career as a vibraphonist, ended up in the Berkshires, he ended up in near Woodstock, and he created a music school where avant-garde improvisers and musicians would come every summer. That's one example, and there are many others. There was a very rich reception of avant-garde jazz in Germany. One of the finest studies free jazz was written by a critic named Eckhard Jost, and I think it was published in 1970. And at the same time, in France, French writers, many of them influenced by Althusserian Marxism, were writing intriguing, if somewhat recondite, articles on the meaning of the new jazz. They were also very influenced by Amiri Baraka, and two of them, who were associated with radical film criticism with Cahiers de Cinéma, published a book called Free Jazz, Black Power. So, to some extent, it was, I think, a development of a European radical tradition. And then in other ways, as you suggest, Agnes, it was a rebellion against some of the constraints and the curmudgeonliness that someone like Adorno expressed.
Adam, what an engaging and invigorating talk. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
You talked about how jazz musicians are conscious of their history. Is it within the scope of your book to discuss the influence of jazz beyond what you've explained here, or is that, I don't mean to ask too much.
Ask me when I'm done.
and if not, maybe you can just tell us a little bit, how does this influence other genres, rock, pop, et cetera, or maybe that's just beyond the scope of what you're doing?
It's not something. It's something that I gesture to at times, but it's not a focus. But I mean, for example, I think that when I'm writing about Alice Coltrane, for example, I talk about the fact that her music has been very important to Johnny Greenwood, of Radiohead. In fact, Johnny Greenwood is fascinated both by Alice Coltrane and by the French composer Olivier Messiaen. And in my view, there are interesting links between Alice Coltrane and Messiaen. Both are spiritual composers, both are organists, both have this background in church music, and both are in these radically symbiotic couples. Alice Coltrane with John Coltrane, Olivier Messiaen with his wife, Yvonne Loriot, who was his great interpreter. So I do talk about the impact of the music outside of this genre. But as I mentioned earlier, the genre that I'm writing about is very porous, and I'm not always writing about jazz in this book. I mean, to me, for example, a figure like, I'm not writing about him in this book, but you could make a case for someone like Andre 3000 or, George Clinton or Kendrick Lamar. I mean, these are all people, I think, who are deeply interested in sonic experimentation.
Adam, thank you. I'm way in the back.
Hello.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, and thank you also for your last answer, which goes some way towards asking a question that I had on my mind. But the other question, luckily, which I had for you was that it seems to me in some ways you're really talking about jazz as a historical object, as in something of the past in some way, right? And so my question really is, what makes this an object of the past? In other words, what is the moment at which you would say it becomes an object of the past, and what are the social, historical, and cultural forces, very broadly speaking, that delimit it and make it an object that is a historical object rather than an object of current day discussion?
It's a great question. I wish I had an answer as articulate as your question. To go back to that exchange between, there was that famous exchange I mentioned earlier in a piece called Jazz Death. It's a piece by the Roscoe Mitchell Art Ensemble from 1968. This was the band that would a year later become the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And Lester Bowie, the trumpeter in the band, impersonates a writer for what is called Jism magazine. So you can get a sense of the contempt for the critics in that remark. And this guy asks, so is jazz as we know it dead? And then Lester Bowie says, that depends on what you know. And then he plays this 6-minute solo filled with wild sounds of farting, long silences. actually, it's at the very end of that he says, that depends on what you know. Hey, hey, hey. So, that would be the easy response, that, this is a music that continues, that remains vibrant, that continues to flourish, that, but I have to say that I have a somewhat elegiac relationship to this music, as you suspected when you said that I seem to be arguing that it is a kind of historical object. I think that perhaps the very success of this movement that I'm describing, its creativity and invention, the development of new forms, the openness to other forms of music, means that the music out of which it emerged has turned into something else, or is being performed as a repertoire music. And I suppose if you wanted to, periodize it, God, I'm sounding like a historian now. It would probably be sometime in the early 1980s when a young man from New Orleans arrives on the scene named Wynton Marsalis, and begins to take to task not just fusion musicians who are combining jazz and rock, but also members of the Avant-Garde, and claiming that they can't play. And he was also, of course, lighting into Miles Davis. Lester Bowie referred to Wynton Marsalis and the Young Lions as androids, and said that this is the first time in the history of jazz that the king of jazz has been elected by hasn't been elected by other musicians. Now, I don't. I mean, he had reason to be angry. I'm not hostile to Wynton Marsalis. I think he's done some very interesting things, and Jazz at Lincoln Center is in some ways a remarkable achievement. But it does mark, in my view, the end of something, and the passage of that the end of jazz as a center of that kind of sonic experimentation. I think it moves to other areas of music, and I think you're now more likely to find it in things like hip hop than you do in jazz. Why? Well, I mean, in a sense, the answer goes back to the very birth of this avant-garde in the 1940s, with the emergence of the Bebop movement in places like Minton's and on 52nd Street, when jazz ceases to be a social music and a dance music and becomes an art music. And you do lose something when a musical form becomes more autonomous and more separated from the social world that gave birth to it. And in a sense, the loft scene is an attempt to, you could say, revive jazz as a popular form. So are the concerts that Amiri Baraka was organizing with the Black Arts Repertoire Theater in the 1960s. I mean, there are other examples of this, but by then, by the 1960s, jazz increasingly had become an art music, although without the kind of social capital or access to resources that classical music enjoyed, to return to the Bourdieusian argument that Sian was making earlier.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about Chicago and the milieu in Chicago that, with its improvisational nature, the blues scene that emerged there, and particularly the theatrical improvisation that was going on the stages, that was so very important to the jazz scene. So I'm very curious about Chicago.
Actually, theater was more important to the St. Louis scene, which was the Black Artist Group, which emerged just after the AACM and chose not to affiliate with it. The AACM emerged in '65, founded by the pianist Muhal Richard Abrams and a group of other musicians. But it was very much centered on music. There were, innovative artists working in Chicago at that time. Of course, there's the whole blues scene. There's Chess Records. There's no shortage of creativity in other forms. But the ACM and the music that arises out of it, that's really an avant-garde jazz scene. It's in St. Louis with the Black Artist Group that you see a coming together of painters like Oliver Lee Jackson, choreographers, writers like I'm forgetting his name. First name is Malinke, and I'm all of a sudden forgetting his name. But an important writer who worked with Julius Hemphill, the alto saxophonist. It's really in St. Louis that you see a coming together of people working in different artistic disciplines.
Fabulous talk, Adam. Do you listen to music when you write, and does it vary from project to project?
I don't. I rarely listen to music while I'm writing, but whenever I'm writing about a musician, I really plunge into the work, and often I'm only listening to that work. It's almost as if I'm living in that sound. So, I mean, for example, when I was writing about Alice Coltrane lately, I almost listened to nothing else for weeks. I just, it's kind of a madness actually. But no, I don't listen. I don't listen while accompanying myself to music. It's just too distracting. On the other hand, what I do is if I'm writing about a specific piece of music, I continue to play parts of it while I'm describing it, just so I get the description right.
No, I forgot.
It's okay.
No,
it's got to end somewhere.
When my father studied music, he told me it was you would get kicked out of the university or the conservatory if they caught you playing jazz. And when I studied music, it was like the jazz was, they had jazz departments. I think Steve Lacy talked about that too. That when jazz became an art form and included in this elite university, did that change what jazz was? This acceptance into the academia.
Yeah, I think I would turn your question into an answer to Abhishek's question, because I mentioned the emergence of Wynton Marsalis, but the academicization of jazz is also, I think, critical to this story. Miles Davis came from a very prosperous family. His father was a doctor. He owned a lot of land. I mean, there's this very misguided, mistaken notion that somehow jazz musicians, all the great jazz musicians, all came from these poor families. Nothing could be further from the truth. And Miles was, I think, a perfect example of this. I mean, he was sent to New York with quite a bit of money in his pocket to attend Juilliard. But when Miles got to New York, he found that he was learning a lot more from Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker than he was at Juilliard, and he was very frustrated by the pedagogy there, which was very limited and often quite racist. And he said that, yes, I came to New York to go to Juilliard, but I attended the University of Charlie Parker. And I think that university it exerts less of an influence today than it once did. Cecil Taylor makes a similar point in this great documentary that was made for Swiss television in 1966 called Les Grandes Répétitions, the Great Rehearsals. And it was a show, it was a series of documentaries about some of the great composers of the era. I think Messiaen was one of the figures in it, Stockhausen, and Cecil Taylor was the one quote-unquote jazz musician. And you see him in this private residence in France, and he looks incredibly cool with his black turtleneck. It's like he's performing in a Godard film. And he says that I went to school in Boston, but what I really learned, I learned from across the tracks, on the other side of the tracks. And this Swiss interviewer says, but what was on the other side of the tracks? Was there another school? It's like, no, there's nothing on the other side of the tracks, just grass and trees. So yes, I agree. Thank you so much.